Hey, how's everybody doing? Hope things are going all right in your semi-lockdown mode. Um, Another video today. This one's going to be about, well, what we see and what we think. See if I can, the quote at the beginning is from Lord of the Rings. Those of you who know me know I'm a big Lord of the Rings guy, but I wanted to suggest, and let me set some context. So in that story, one of the messages in that story is despair is the weapon of darkness, right? The enemy, whatever you want to call it, the dark spirit, negative, evil, okay? And so both Saruman and Denethor, who are both leaders, very proud, smart men, use this device to try and gain more power, and they think they have control over it, but they end up just seeing things that make them give up, that make them despair. And at one point, Gandalf says, dangerous to us all are the devices of a power deeper than that which we ourselves possess. He says that the Palantir was basically a technology that they didn't really understand, that it could be used to make them see only certain things, and they could be controlled that way. So Denethor gives in to despair, and Saruman thinks that he can control the ring, that he's better than everybody, smarter than everybody, and that's the danger of pride, which is a universal theme. But one of the things I've been thinking about lately is, so before the internet, and going even further back, right, before TV connectivity, you had radio and stuff, but, your world was basically your little community, your village. And that's kind of what you saw. But you knew there was a wider world out there, and, you could leave there and go learn and experience new things, and you were open to things because you knew that geographically, physically, your world space was limited. But now, of course, with connectivity, we think, well, we're seeing the whole world, right? But you're not. We're not. We're still seeing a village, right? Because especially as we get into these ideological bubbles, right? And so we see these things and we think that's everything. Because, well, I'm connected. I must be seeing everything. But we're not. We're still only seeing a tiny part. And, of course, we think we're seeing what we choose to see. But we all know algorithms about search engines and stuff. It's being conditioned, so it's much more dangerous because we imagine, well, this is what's really going on. But as I've said many times, we're terrible with numbers, right? It's why casinos make money. So we imagine that what we're seeing must be evidence of, what the world is really like. And yet, it's so much more complicated. So what we see now is, right, and it's easy for people to skew those things, right? So we don't look at numbers on police brutality. Those statistics get messy, right? So you see an image and you go, oh my God, this is terrible, right? And we think our perception is accurate because, well, we're seeing it, but we're not seeing everything at all. In fact, again, we should be aware that it's like we're still in a little village. It's always going to be that way. So narrow human knowledge, or so vast the world of knowledge, so narrow human wit, as Alexander Pope puts it, right? We still aren't seeing all this stuff. So we can despair. We can start to give up and think, oh my gosh, it's all screwed, right? But the vast majority, again, of people are decent people. And, of course, in this milieu, what do you hear? You hear from all the vocal people, the extremists who are screaming one thing or the other, right? Because they're the ones that are on there screaming the nonsense and on both ends of the political spectrum. And you can imagine, oh my God, there's all these evil racists, or there's all these, radical leftists. But the reality is, numerically, okay, we're still very much in the middle, and we're still very reasonable, good people who've learned to master their own sinfulness, right, and to try to build a life. As I said in the previous one, right, who are trying to diminish suffering and make a good life for their kids, and who don't want to contribute to the suffering of other people. But the more we look into this Palantir, this technology, right? The more we think what we're seeing is what's really going on. And again, people will use that fear to exploit us, both sides of the political spectrum. And we have to be clear on that, right? It takes much, and I've said this many times to my students. If you confuse information with the knowledge necessary to process that information dispassionately, right? You're in for a very, very chaotic situation, as information ages have dictated in the past when they've happened. right? A little learning is a dangerous thing. So, I mean, say what you want about the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, yeah? As they're trying to set up I don't know, some kind of communal state, right? Brook Farm, the Panasocracy scheme, where all these ideal schemes of creating these ideal societies. Soviet Union, right? They haven't worked. They usually descend into oppression of one kind or another because it doesn't take human nature into account. There are always going to be some people who will take more, who haven't mastered their own evil enough. And by that I mean their own selfishness, their own pride, that they're different and they deserve something more than someone else. That's what we're all trying to defeat, right? Is that evil in ourselves that leads us to contribute to suffering. So we stare into this thing and you're doing it now. I'm doing a video on it, right? But this bubble has the illusion of being the whole world. And statistically, we imagine that it is. Oh, well, look, I've got all this access. I must know what's going on. But knowledge, deep knowledge, Nicholas Carr talks about this, right? In his Google Making Us Stupid and The Shallows, right? His book. That's not deep knowledge. Knowing where to find something and seeing the surface of something is not the same as knowing it. Right? Getting into the statistical numbers about police brutality incidents with regard to minorities, okay? And looking that there just isn't statistically this thing. Now, there's issues of excessive force, right? And none of that is to suggest that we don't need reform. Of course we do. We need reform across the board. But if you begin and assume that your first impression is the correct one, and that there's not a number of complex issues involved, it's a very dangerous thing. And so you can despair and decide, well, we have to do this, right? And end up inflicting more suffering than you're alleviating. And it's a dangerous thing, right? The pride that comes along with it, where you think, well, I have this degree and I went to this school and I've got this, and you don't. No, it's complicated. And the people who were there, and there's people who spend their whole lives on this stuff, who have a much better chance of getting at the deep core reason. Okay? Again, so wide is knowledge, so narrow human wit. Each might his several province well command, would all but stoop to what they understand, as Pope says. Yeah? We have to focus on what we can control and try to alleviate suffering. But if we give in to despair because we think the world is so dark and everything is so bad, right? Despite everything that's going on, okay, there's never been a better time to be alive on the planet. Worldwide poverty reduced substantially over the past 2 decades. Ridiculously, okay? Lifespan, etc., all that stuff, it's getting better, all right? Now, measured against the perfect, everything's going to suck, always. And what the dark spirit, as St. Ignatius calls it, wants to do is convince us, hey, right, it's not perfect. It's terrible. And none of this, again, is to suggest that we just go, okay, and be complacent. Every generation has things that need to be solved. But perspective is essential. And if you start tearing down monuments and destroying statues, you start forgetting perspective. You start losing perspective. You start thinking that you can make something perfect. Which, again, if you could make a perfect individual, you could do. And don't think that there aren't geneticists and genetic engineers who are thinking, wonder if that's possible, right? So many sci-fi things talk about that. But, so a human's going to create the perfect human, but a human's flawed. You can't get outside. You can't redefine human nature to create the perfect society. So stop measuring the world as inadequate against the ideal. Keep the ideal in mind as something we're going to pursue. And my daughters will pursue it, and their children will pursue it, and they won't reach it. But it's the pursuit. It's the progress towards that matters. And this society, this system, has achieved the greatest amount of individual freedom, personal wealth, chance for success of any that's ever been. Has it done wrong things? Absolutely it has. As has every single culture in human history. And none of this, as I've said many times, is to suggest that people in this society are somehow inherently more valuable than other people. Okay? But it's a system that works. And it is the act of despair to make us think we should just destroy it and start over. That it should be torn down. Again, it's easier to destroy something beautiful and complex, much easier than it is to create it. So you better keep that in mind. It's not so dark here. Go outside, have a look around, look at your kids, look at your life. You're watching on a device me talk about this stuff. That's an amazing thing. We're communicating with one another. I mean, holy cow. It's ridiculous how fortunate we are. And that's not by chance. It's by hard work and sacrifice and labor, and it is something which must be preserved, not as it is, right? In other words, it has to evolve, of course. But to give up on it, to despair of it, especially based on false premises or misperceptions, is a dangerous thing. And so, as we consider this issue, right, if we don't understand human nature, okay, to be prideful, and we have to understand that in ourselves more than anything, right, and approach life with humility. The one thing I know is I don't know anything. And I'm continuing to learn and ask questions and evolve, and right, that has to be the way it is. Anybody who tells you they've got to figure it out and this is what we should do, especially if they say we should do something that inflicts suffering on other people, right? This is our time. This is our life. These are the questions. This is our struggle. Okay, and it's complex and difficult. And if we descend into it being easy and into shouting at one another, we're not going to get anywhere. And remember, power is always interested in splitting us and dividing us against one another, because it's human nature to want power. That's part of understanding human nature, that the people in government are going to want to stay there. Duh. Which is why the Founding Fathers tried to put a system in place. But they'll try to control what we see so that we'll despair and we'll give up and we'll imagine that there's nobody who's thinking clearly, because we have conflicting issues. We all feel conflict. We're all outraged by what happened to George Floyd. We all want a fair, equal system for everybody. Okay? Or the vast majority, right? Clearly there's racists and clearly there's extremists on the other side. But the vast majority of people want a solution that satisfies everybody and that's just and fair. And we're going to work toward that. But right now, extremes are shouting, as they always do. And so, again, we look into the Palantir, into the internet, and we imagine, oh, the extremes are taking over. And it's usually whatever extreme is presented as negative by our particular village, in our particular window. So we think, oh, God, yeah? But the vast majority of us aren't like that. As evidenced by the fact that this society's been successful, in spite of itself, and that it has remedied itself and sought to atone and change and evolve to be more of what it's supposed to be. Remember, don't be pit against one another, and don't despair. There's an awful lot of good in the world and good people. We're capable of selfishness, but we're also capable of selflessness and seeing things bigger than ourselves and working towards those things. And that's hugely important. So don't despair. Remember that what we're seeing in the Palantir and the internet is not all there is. We're still only seeing as through a glass darkly. We're still only seeing a limited thing. And we have to remember that. We have to dig deeper, and we're going to take action that's going to alleviate suffering and not increase it. All right? So the quote at the beginning, I haven't talked about Theoden yet. It's not so dark here. Simple quote. Theoden's a king in Lord of the Rings, and he's had a counselor who's been keeping him in his hall and telling him all these terrible things, and right, that, oh, you're too old. It's dark out there. It's dangerous. It's really bad. And so he's been in his little world, his little village, listening to his wise counselor, who's telling him only these things because he wants to strip him of his power. Because that's what despair does. And so Theoden suddenly has to think, oh. And he goes outside, Gandalf comes, and what Gandalf does isn't magical like in the movie where he extracts the control. No, he just takes him outside, and Theoden looks on nature and sees the sun hitting his lands, and he says, it's not so dark here. So, guess what? It's not so dark here. Don't despair. Keep hope. And remember, okay, the vast majority of people in this nation are good people who want to alleviate suffering. They're not racist, either implicit or they're not. Okay? They're just people with blind spots and have to fight their own selfishness like we all do. So, remember always, it's much more important to do right than to be right. Remember to hit like, share, and subscribe. If you feel like it, hit comments too below. Love to hear from y'all. Again, peace.